Now we're going to try this new way of doing it. And I ran across this card, which seemed appropriate for at the beginning of this hellacious year of major climate disasters and heat domes and floods and you name it. So I'm hoping that we can deal with these extreme abnormals and get ready for them. And I did want to mention that I'm speaking from the traditional lands of the Patwin people who've lived here for thousands of years and are still stewards of the land and teaching younger generations how to honor and save our resources. Here are the topics I'd like to speak about today. Basically, a brief introduction on overheating and climate change, especially in Canada, and why it's important and why indoor heat is important. And then an overview of overheating and passive survivability standards and guidelines from around the world, and some updates with all the great work that's going on in Canada. And then give some examples of how to adapt buildings to make them resilient for heat waves and adapted for future climate and outages, power outages. And then some conclusions and recommendations and Q&A. And basically what we need to do to achieve these climate adapted buildings is move towards passive low carbon cooling, where the buildings can perform very efficiently and safely, even sometimes without power, but especially as the external heat loads become much more severe, and avoid just putting air conditioning in buildings and creating a death spiral in terms of GHG emissions and grid loads and so on. So we are shifting in a big way towards more extreme abnormal heat, as you can see here, based on.
I find this is controversial.
Somebody's talking in the background. Okay. Anyway, we're shifting towards these extreme 3 and 4 standard deviation levels, and the peak is flattening and spreading out. So we're still getting some cold extremes, but we're getting even more of the real hot extremes. And the reason is that we're basically pumping 5 Hiroshima atomic bombs every second into the environment. And this is something that keeps me up at night. We're talking about in the order of 10 to 23rd joules or 10 to the 20th BTUs per second. So that's one reason why main reason why we're now in a crisis, climate crisis or emergency. The future is here now. It's coming sooner than we think. We're seeing more and more extreme heat events and other storms. The mega drought in the Southwest is well underway. Mega fires, mega wildfires, we're seeing those all around the world, as well as marine heat waves. We'll talk about those a little bit. And then perhaps less certain, but a big concern is that the global systems are starting to approach the tipping points quickly. So it's coming, the future's coming early, it's not evenly distributed, and we need to take large scale effective actions immediately. There we go. So why is extreme abnormal heat so important? Those extreme heat events are becoming hotter, longer, and more extreme. They're driving the health ecosystem and infrastructure impacts. Those health impacts are nonlinear. And in addition, it's not the super extreme events that kill the most people. Actually, because there's so many people exposed to the moderate heat, that actually has the higher mortality impact. And then we also are very concerned about cascading and compound climate impacts and the feedback loops. And so now we're seeing this increasing heat, increasing rapidly in many regions. In Canada especially, it's rising faster and it'll get worse compared to the rest of North America. So I'm going to try to share some data on these indices. And the bad news is that buildings and infrastructure in Canada are not prepared for these changes, like much of the world. Let's see, we've already talked about this. The bottom line is we used to think of worst case scenarios as very extreme outliers. I think we need to rethink that because the worst case has gotten so much worse. So I think we need to think about much bigger safety margins now. So here's some historical data, changes in the maximum daytime and nighttime temperatures. And on the left, you can see daytime. Canada is a relative hotspot for North America, like much of the northern latitudes. And if you go to the nighttime, it's the changes are even bigger in Canada. You're all familiar with this, I'm sure, the mass casualty events that woke up a lot of people around the world, or at least in the US and Canada. And there were about 500 excess deaths in BC and thousands hospitalized. The highest risk were indoors, especially older persons and those that did not have air conditioning or didn't use it. We've experienced these kind of heat domes and high pressure situations in California several times, some deadly heat waves in 2006 and previously. But this time we really dodged the bullet because of some strange weather. It shifted north, and some of that is probably due to changes in jet stream and other interesting events. But mainly climate change has just amplified all these anomalous events. Okay, here's a great site that I got to dig into finally, thanks to your invitation. I looked at the climate data Canada interactive map, and they map cooling degree days, heating degree days, tropical nights. Here's some examples of the 18 centigrade cooling degree days for late century on the top right. You can see some hot spots there where it's dark blue. And for example, in Sudbury, the cooling degree days will increase, will go up to 700 some degrees, which is fairly high. It means that you're probably going to need a fair amount of air conditioning and energy efficiency. If you are familiar with cooling degree days, it's basically the difference between a set point, say 18 centigrade or 65 Fahrenheit, and the number of cumulative hours and days over the year that you're above that set point. So it's kind of a cumulative indicator how much cooling demand or heating demand if you're doing that metric. And the tropical nights are concerned because that's a big health risk factor when people can't recover from hot days and don't sleep well and so on. And if you look at the bottom slide, when you click on any of these spots on the upper map, it'll give you details of what the climate projections are. And so this is late century, the high emission 8.5 scenario, and you can see the Sudbury and some other areas get up to maybe as much as 1,000 cooling degree days, maybe 300, 500 by mid-century. I'm going to try to skip through these so we can cover a lot, and then we can you can always read the slides later, I guess. But now another reason Canada is at high risk is the Northwest Atlantic is one of the fastest parts of the ocean, and especially the northeast coast of North America is a hotspot, as you can see on the map. On the top and the bottom, you can see projected permanent heat waves in the ocean, the marine heat waves. And you can see that on the lighter colors, the west coast of North America is a hot spot. It's going to be in near permanent heat wave by between 2020s and 2040s, which is on us now. And then, so that's contributing to some of these extreme events. Here's a projection from earlier in the week of today's heat index, which includes temperature and humidity. And I've never seen so much purple, high heat index levels of 105 or the higher levels. And even the yellow 115 levels down in the Southwest, Texas, and a little bit maybe in Florida. Earlier this year, I saw 120 heat index reported down in southern Texas on the Gulf. So about 100 million people or more in the US have been exposed to this. So in the last month, according to some federal websites. Now back to Canada, projections for the future, I believe this is late century, or at the top is up to mid-century. They're projecting to see a big increase in hot humid days, that is humidex over 35°C, about 50 days. And then by late century, that'll increase to about 100 days in some of these hot spots, kind of in central, southern Canada and over towards the Great Lakes. And this is a fun graphic and interactive web tool that you can use to put your location in and see what the future climate's going to be like based on various, several weather variables and models. And Ottawa's projected to be more like Chicago climate-wise by 2080. So why is indoor heat exposure so important? We spend about 90% of our time indoors, especially if there's a heat wave or a pandemic or wildfire, and the allergens and mosquito vectors have been increasing too, which sends us indoors more. Power outages have also increased more. Most heat-related deaths, at least in developed countries, occur indoors because indoors can become very hot. Also, thermal stress has significant effects on things such as sleep, student performance, and worker productivity, which have big health and economic impacts. And we know that energy and climate inequity occurs in many regions and has been exacerbated by increased utility, housing, and healthcare costs. So we need our homes, schools, and other buildings to shelter us and allow us to recover. Now here's some data on why indoor heat is so important. Basically on the right, 2/3 of the mortality from the big 2006 heat wave in California were at-home deaths. And you can see that on the left, the risk, relative risks only went up to about 1.2, but on the right, the highest levels exceeded 1.2, and some of those were on the coast, which are cool climates where people don't have much air conditioning and aren't used to such heat. Unfortunately, most programs and risk estimates don't factor this in. But we already knew that heat was a problem in existing and new buildings from various field studies. And for example, California new homes surveyed, 19% of those were too hot. In the Harlem heat study, where they did monitoring and citizen science, they found that the apartments were basically, these low-income apartments were basically in a permanent heat wave when it was fairly hot outside, and indoor temperatures exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Many schools have been closing. In Arizona, they're getting more and more deaths. And this study, they found that over a couple of years, there were 100 indoor deaths. The indoor temperatures were up to 125, and the AC was broken off in many cases. This modeling study from Los Angeles region by UCLA in Arizona modeled the time to reach 90 degrees Fahrenheit indoors on a hot day, not a super hot day. And they saw that many of these building types exceeded 90 within the first day or two. Most of those were multifamily or townhouse buildings from the pre-1990s or 60s. Mobile homes are probably also very quick to heat up, but they weren't included. This Berlin modeling study by Oliver Buschin and others, they did a lot of work on looking at intervention measures on how to effectively reduce indoor heat, and the passive cooling measures the most effective. The urban greening measures weren't all that effective, but things like shading and insulation, air sealing were very important. And they recommended doing all of the above to keep indoor heat levels down. They also looked at mortality and how to better model that. And they found that if they did included an indoor exposure estimate and a nonlinear model, it gave much tighter fit, more accurate assessment. And the risk rates were also much higher. The mortality rates were more like 120 versus 80. Canada's done some great work on looking at the health and cost impacts of climate change and heat. This report estimated that it's going to be about $9 billion per year mid-century. And a lot of that is going to be due to indoor heat exposures. Another study also looked at the benefits of energy efficiency measures such as shading and green roofs. And they found that there were significant cost benefits there as well. A new driving factor is going to be liability. There's been some landmark cases about lawsuits and nursing home deaths have resulted in lawsuits. And the professional associations for architects and engineers in British Columbia have issued professional guidance on climate liability standards and conduct and how to work with clients. So where will heat impacts occur? Basically everywhere. We're seeing many parts of the country too hot and leading to poor test performance and school closures. Homes and facilities for vulnerable populations are another hotspot we need to be concerned about. Schools, I mentioned, maladapted buildings that are inefficient and don't have good passive or active cooling. Both urban and rural buildings are at risk. Rural homes tend to be less efficient. Populations are low income, have lower health status, and so on. Maladapted power grid is another big weak link in the system and protecting us from extreme heat. And that is slowly being upgraded, at least in some parts of the country. And then many people don't have good access to energy efficiency improvements, emergency cooling, healthcare, and so on. And this is a song that's been running through my head for months as more friends over the last few years talk about moving to Canada or Maine or even there's some articles now about Duluth, Minnesota has become a new climate refugee location. In general, low-income households are going to be the most affected, and this is an energy and climate equity issue. And 1 in 5 households in the U.S. Are foregoing food, medicine to pay for energy. So that's why we see in many of these heat waves and heat domes where many of the deaths and hospitalizations are where people couldn't fix air conditioning or didn't want to run it because of the high energy bills. I've done some updating of this number that we did back in 2014 or whatever, these numbers on vulnerable populations, and this is a sampling. But the bottom line is that over 40% of US adults have one of these major risk factors for heat sensitivity or vulnerability, and many of them have multiple factors or mortality, comorbidity risks. I did look up some Canadian data, and you can see that in general, there are more older persons than Canada, just slightly. And that the age demographic projections indicate that Canada could get much higher in terms of both the 65 plus and the 85 plus year olds. The good news is that there's less of these other chronic disease factors like obesity, heart disease, kidney disease, and so on in Canada. And asthma is a new confirmed risk factor, I think, for heat sensitivity. in terms of mortality. I think morbidity and the rate in Canada is slightly higher, around 9% versus 7 or 8%. So in conclusion, many people have comorbidities, and the dementia and Alzheimer's population is growing rapidly to even amplify that. So we have a perfect storm, these demographic shifts, the chronic risks increasing, housing crisis, other costs increasing, power outages increasing, and climate change is multiplying all these risks. One thing that's really peeved me is the terminology for in this field, and the jargon has just gotten really jumbled and confusing, complex. But I'll just give you a few examples here. There's some that deal with short-term overheating and health risks, and passive survivability is maybe one of the earliest ones. Over the long term, the UK folks started out with future-proof and fit for purpose, and then there's all kinds of different options. And this issue was recently reviewed by a group that came out with some recommendations, I think. I tend to like things that are explicit about climate, future climate, and resilient and adapted, so there's not too much ambiguity. And so this review paper basically said that we need to look at both the time frame and the scale of the overheating, the heat exposure, and the disruption factors. And so what I'm going to mainly be talking about today on the right is resilience of a building over the long term, over repeated intense events and long events in some cases. This is a nice tool from the UK years ago. It frames the process that I'm going to walk through. Is basically identifying the problems, setting up your criterion, standards and targets for overheating, then use some weather files for current future weather for urban heat and extreme situations. Then first look at your options to improve passive cooling efficiency. Then you can downsize the mechanical cooling needs. And then if the new wave is to do multi-objective optimization to combine all of these different cooling options to find the best mix. And then monitor and verify the building performance. And this is starting to happen in some passive house projects where the designers are finding out that their buildings aren't performing as designed. A big surprise. So they are able to go in and fix it and add additional shading or fix some other systems issues. Let's see, I'm going to skip over this. It's basically saying that comments on the BC recommendations after the heat dome. We need to not just give people free AC and fans, because that's not enough. We also need to adapt buildings and consider how they interact. And the benefit is that you can also get carbon reductions. You can get control virus infection better and so on. So now I got to get out of this and see if we can find the other slide. Meanwhile, do we have any questions?
Tom, I think we'll save questions for the end if that's all right with you.
Okay.
And then, but yeah, if you do have a question, please feel free to write it in the chat while Tom gets his second slideshow up.
I guess it's just, I've overloaded my system. Here we go. Okay. Hey, okay. So I'm going to whip through these because we're probably over time, but the international standards, The UK has been the leader, and the passive house standards have been around for a while. But the most widely used, I think, is the SIPSI TM59 design guide from the UK that specified different temperature limits for mechanical natural ventilation and using future scenarios. And there's also an urban heat design guide that they developed, which has been used by London for their standards. And the big news, the big, I think, shift has been they finally got the standard adopted in the UK to use the SIPSI overheating standard in their future building standards, and it's for residential only so far. The reviewers said that they could still have over 1 million homes could still suffer from overheating, but there were significant health benefits and valuation when that was the impact assessment was done. So that's a good thing, to have low carbon, healthy buildings that are fit for the future. There's also some older guidelines for schools in various countries, including New Zealand, I think, and Canada and Britain. And this is just an example from New Zealand, where they have different climate zones and different temperature limits and different numbers of hours and the maximum temperature. There's a new review of the European overheating standards from the International Energy IEA Annex 80 Resilient Cooling Group, which has done a lot of great work in this area. And I recommend you check out their website. But they found that many of these national standards don't address future climate change or heat events, but there's an urgent need to harmonize these standards to implement the EU energy standards. So they recommended some framework and performance indicators and metrics to help this. In the US, there's not much happening. There's some local standards, and nursing homes have a federal standard, but it doesn't apply to all of them. Hospital and care facilities have some standards, but there's limited enforcement. British Columbia has been a leader in this area in recent years. They have the energy step code, which so far is voluntary, but a lot of people are using it, and I think it will probably become mandatory at some point, if nothing else, to limit liability. But they have some temperature limits and include, I believe, future weather files. And then Langley at one point was drafting a standard to implement the step code, but I don't know where that is right now. And then there's been a huge amount of work done by the National Research Council, NRC of Canada, in their construction innovation group. And they've developed overheating guidelines and modeled various situations, including long-term care homes, and come up with recommended overheating and temperature limits there and metrics. They've developed a methodology to overheat the risk. They have, I believe, some summer reference weather files. They've also looked at heat cold stress. There's been some voluntary work in the US on voluntary standards, starting with, I guess LEED was maybe the earliest, but there wasn't much uptake on that. And it's maybe being updated or reviewed now. Last time I checked, it was. The Build a Green for California included some general language to address overheating. And then we drafted, we included some overheating specs for schools in California and several US states through the Collaborative for High Performance Schools program, the CHIPS program, kind of like LEED, but more advanced in this area. And it includes both long-term overheating prevention as well as energy resilience during outages and passive survivability. The latest news from California is that after many long delays, the occupational indoor heat standard is being finalized this August, and they're talking about 82 Fahrenheit trigger temperatures, and then more aggressive action at 87 Fahrenheit. For residential standards, there's not much in sight except to develop recommendations by 2025, and that process has just started. We did develop extreme heat action plans in 2013 and 22 to address building standards and low-income weatherization, but those have never really been funded, and they're moving slowly. Future weather files are the next step when you do these overheating assessments and mitigations. I'm just going to kind of skip through this, but I did want to highlight that after many years of trying to get it through, California's finally got hourly future weather files that will be readily available in the cloud through the Adapt analytics engine. And they're working on including extreme temperature event distribution for things like wildfires and the grid management and so on, and grid planning. And this is just an example of maybe one of the gold standards for future weather files, where they do dynamic downscale projections, high spatial resolution, and it also includes urban heat projections based on vegetation and land use projections, which most weather files don't. There's a lot of different types of weather files, and morphed statistical downscale files are widely used around the world. I believe in Canada, that's what the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium is using. And Canada is using that to develop recommended guidelines for their various climate zones, and they're actually implementing that now in the city of Darwin, so that's going to be exciting. This is just what morphed weather files look like, where they just adjust for the temperature, but not humidity or air stagnation and clouds or whatever. Extreme weather files are kind of a growing area of interest, and there's also new research on forecasting and modeling extreme weather events and extreme future climates, like the ones that are happening more and more, like the heat domes. And then finally, some examples. How are we doing on time?
All good.
There's been a huge boom in the last few years. I can't keep up with it anymore. And just like I've kind of given up trying to track heat wave and other related news items. It's just so overwhelming and intimidating at times, and depressing at times too. But the good news is that people are working on it more and more to address this issue and provide safe buildings. This is one of the first passive house retrofits, and it's a tower in Hamilton, Ontario, where they used 2050 temperature projections, and they were able to not only reduce energy use over that projected period, but to show a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by doing all these improvements to the building envelope and systems in terms of efficiencies to be designed for cooling instead of typical heat-oriented design. And the result was that they project this building, these units will stay warm in the winter for up to 2 days, whereas before basic design, they would only last 2 hours. And in the summer, they could stay at a safe temperature for up to 4 days versus a half a day in a typical building. This project, I think, is part of the tower renewal project that Toronto and maybe the Atmospheric Fund are funding. And so that's exciting that this is being deployed. And then this is a modeling study done by RDH for University of British Columbia and I think BC Housing. And they modeled new and existing building archetypes for multifamily. low and high rise. And they used the ASHRAE thermal comfort metrics and the 200-hour and 20-hour limits, and the high emission 8.5 climate change scenarios for different time periods of the century. They also modeled power outages and looked at the incremental costs and different design strategies. The results were that, voila, they could really reduce the number of overheating hours. You see on the top there, some of them were up to 800 at the baseline almost, but they could knock it down below 200 in most cases. The red bars indicate the cost, and let me move my bar here. They could get the costs down fairly low on some of these bundles, where they included fixed shading and other more efficient measures. And then bundle 5 and bundle 7 were very low in terms of overheating hours, and the costs were much lower too. In fact, this bundle 4 actually saved 22% of, for example, for the energy savings. There's a lot, most of the studies have been done, of course, either in the UK or in the hotter climates of the US, but there's some work done in the northern climates in Chicago. I picked this one because Chicago is not too far from Canada, and you can see that that blue climate zone reaches up into Western Canada. So the bottom line is here that at the start of the century, over on the left, you could, if you went to a newer, more efficient building code in Chicago, you actually increased some of the overheating indicated in the yellow part of the pie chart. When you go to the middle of the century weather conditions, you get a big bump up in the kind of orange part, up to 15% overheating. And you can reduce that a little bit if you use the more modern code, but you really need to go to a modern code with passive cooling, passive survival measures such as shading and better insulation, air sealing, and so on. And you can almost eliminate the more severe red part of the pie there on the right, and then reduce also the moderate discomfort levels. This is from Bonnie Asadi et al. When he was at David Saylor at Arizona State. This is an interesting modeling study, I think maybe one of the few that's looked at neighborhood level, where they started out with just no adaptation and 100% of these buildings were overheating. And if they just did natural ventilation or just improved the building shell or improved the mechanical systems, they either got very little or some reduction in overheating. But when they combined all of it over on the right, they could really get down to, I think it doesn't show here, but it's like 1% or something. Okay, so where are we? This is, I'm just going to skip ahead and show that we did some modeling of a house in California, and we were able to greatly reduce the cumulative degree hours during a heat wave. For 2006, we reduced the mild overheating. When we used Arizona weather files to model future impacts of climate change, we saw that by mid-century, we could reduce the moderate overheating quite a bit. And we went to late century, we could get the moderate heating down much lower, and also the mild moderate heating. And when we looked at a power outage scenario, historical data, when we did the increased passive cooling efficiency of the building shell, air sealing, as well as the mechanical equipment. Actually here, we didn't have the mechanical equipment. Without that, the extreme severe discomfort level was reached within 4 days of the beginning of the heat wave. But if we optimized fairly well, we could stretch that out to 10 days. So now, fast forward to the 2020s, Canada's a leader again, and they're responding to the climate crisis and emergency. I mentioned the Toronto Tower renewal project. There's a lot of great work to ramp up retrofits from the Reframe project and Passive House Accelerator, and as well as new construction. I mentioned NRC Canada has a lot of good guidance and tools they've developed, and they're planning to propose overheating standards for the 2025 building standards update in Canada, which is great news. University of British Columbia was involved in that RDH modeling study I mentioned, and they applied that the overheating prevention methods to their climate resilient dorms. And then BC Housing is a big leader in terms of their various programs to implement overheating prevention through in public buildings, through policies, training, and so on. So basically, we're starting to see a paradigm shift and ramping up things, at least in some parts of the world, but we need a lot more of that a lot sooner. So some growing R&D areas. I won't go into those right now, but this is one good example here of where they're in Germany. One region they're modeling both the indoor and urban heat and future climate impacts, and then demonstrating in actual buildings how to mitigate that. And they have a cool tool also where you can play around with different intervention measures. It's called the heat tool, and see how it affects overheating. And I think we're shifting away from the reluctance or resistance, the negative pressure to adapt to extreme heat. We've answered a lot of these questions on the right that create negative pressure. Cost and affordability is probably still remaining and will always be an issue, so we need some subsidies to jumpstart things. On the positive side, we're seeing more legislative action, financial incentives, liability, market forces, and all these other things that are improving. So in conclusion, there's a lot of data and examples and modeling and efforts and growing efforts to model and measure and demonstrate that you can mitigate overheating and the energy impacts of climate change. And the overheating prevention efforts are especially active in the UK and now some in Europe, and it's spreading in Canada and Australia as well. China is very active in this area. And when you look at their current heat waves and their boom in building construction, it's not surprising. There are more funding opportunities out there at various levels, and those need to be pursued. But we need to integrate climate adaptation to extreme heat in all of our programs and policies now. And here are just some examples on the right of an early UK development where they did overheating, future climate adaptation, and deployed various measures. And it's, I don't know, 3,000 some homes. So it's probably one of the biggest developments of that type.
I just want to make sure we have enough time for questions.
Okay,
so I'm going to get you to wrap up really soon.
That's it. List of recommendations. Basically, push all the levers that you can to implement these overheating prevention measures. I think even if you can't do the full system and building upgrade, try to figure out how to phase it in when you're replacing some equipment, replacing your roof, or put in some features that allow you to easily upgrade the building later. There's several examples out there, including one in Canada. So basically, we need to accelerate market demand through sustained financing, incentives, and so on. So thank you very much for sharing your lunch hour with me and dealing with our computer problems. And I just want to share this classic song from a Canadian artist, much beloved artist who's actually touring now, but this is an older live thing from Neil Young called Mother Earth, with his old pump organ and a harmonica. and your lovely maple trees. Thank you. And I look forward to chatting with all of you.